This talk is brought to you by the Bamberg Mathematical Consciousness Science Initiative.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Johannes, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be part of this series, which I've also come to several of the talks in the series and have really enjoyed them and just appreciated the general effort in this, direction of mathematical consciousness science. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here. So let me start. With a little example. So if you've ever tried to, let's say, meet a friend in a crowded space like Times Square, you'll know that we can't really fully process all the visual information that's coming into our eyes at any given time. And attention is this cognitive capacity that allows us to prioritize some information at the expense of other information. For example, we can use spatial attention to attend to the right. Let's say if we think our friend is coming from that direction, or if we know our friend is wearing a white shirt, we can use feature-based attention to attend to the color white. So, and you can even try this by just kind of highlighting in your mind all the people in this crowd who are wearing white shirts, and you should see that they kind of come to the fore. Um, so attention, of course, is very closely associated with consciousness. In this famous demo of inattentional blindness, which many of you may be familiar with, attending to the white-shirted players and counting how many times they pass this basketball caused many people to miss seeing a very hairy black creature in their midst. Okay. Here's another demo. This is a change blindness demo in the center. Here I'm alternating between two images. And so something is actually changing between these two images. So I'll give you a moment to look and see if you can find whatever is changing between those images. Feel free to put a +1 in the chat if you have seen it already, or if you're still looking for it. I'll give you another minute for that. Let's see, what do we have here in the chat? Got at least one person has seen it, another three, and coming along line. So I can, oh, is it really actually easy with the, okay. Well then, in that case, this is okay. If you haven't seen it yet, probably have, it's popping in and out of existence in the upper left quadrant here, and you may be able to see this this little blue box popping in and out of existence. Okay. So this is change blindness, and it can take people quite a long time to see that, maybe when we're not screen sharing. And then finally, in hemispatial neglect, my last example here, people with right parietal lobe damage don't notice things on the left side of space unless their attention is explicitly drawn to them. So if you ask someone with hemispatial neglect to draw a clock, you see they're going to draw the round circle and then fill in all these numbers on the right, but leave out all the numbers on the left, unless, until someone says, hey, what about all those numbers on the left? And they'll say, oh, I didn't notice that I hadn't actually filled in the whole clock. Okay, so all these examples illustrate how inattention can lead us to being unaware of objects in our environment. Some people say that you need to attend to something in order to be conscious of it. Others argue against this idea, but basically everyone agrees that attention shapes what we see, and it does this in two ways. So first, attention improves objective performance. So under this category, we place any task where there is actually a right answer, and so performance can be objectively better or worse. So attention improves performance on many basic visual tasks, threshold detection, the discriminability of visual features, contrast sensitivity, spatial resolution, visual acuity, and so on. So for example, if your eyes are on the cross in the center and you attend to the stimulus on the left there, you will be able to discriminate the orientation of that stimulus on the left better than you will be able to discriminate the orientation of the stimulus on the right. Okay, so that's an improvement in objective performance. Now, attention also enhances subjective perception, so very of great interest to us studying consciousness. Under this category, we place any task where there is not a right answer, and the participant just reports how something looks to them. So attention increases visibility, confidence, apparent contrast, perceived spatial frequency, perceived color saturation. There's not a right answer to any of these kinds of tasks. It just makes things look stronger to people. So for example, if your eyes are on the black dot in the center of this image on the right here, and um, now you attend again to the left, you would find that this stimulus on the left, which in reality is only 16% contrast, now looks subjectively equivalent to the stimulus on the right, which is objectively 22% contrast. And this is very foundational work on how attention affects subjective appearance done by Marisa Carrasco and colleagues. Okay, so in consciousness science, we're really interested in understanding the mechanisms of subjective perception. And because attention has all these effects on subjective perception, on the face of it, it seems that attention would really be an ideal tool to investigate the mechanisms of conscious perception, including the neural mechanisms. However, there's often a challenge that we run into in trying to use attention and understand how attention relates to conscious perception, which is that attention generally makes everything we measure just go up. So attention typically increases objective performance, subjective strength, neural responses. Okay, so this covariation, that is everything changes together, and unidimensionality, meaning the changes are just up or down, both make it difficult to isolate attentional impacts and mechanisms that are specific to subjective perception. So it's often not clear whether attention is changing subjective perception in a way that can be pulled apart from other processing that might be completely unrelated to conscious experience. So in the two studies I'm going to tell you about today, we asked, how does attention affect subjective perception specifically? Okay, and so in study one, we addressed the covariation problem by asking whether and how attention affects subjective perception when objective performance is controlled. And then in study two, we addressed the unidimensionality problem by asking whether and how attention can warp perceptual appearance rather than just boosting subjective strength. Okay, so starting then with study one is actually just one small part of a large adversarial collaboration, so-called, to test first order versus higher order theories of consciousness. I'm showing you all the many people who are involved in this large-scale project. And the goal of the part of the project that my lab is working on, together with Megan Peters' lab at UCI, is to determine whether recurrent processing in visual cortex, which is considered kind of first order sensory processing, is sufficient to explain subjective visual perception when it comes apart from objective performance. So the study that I'm going to talk about now is actually the first part of that project. This is a behavioral study that's led by Karen Tian, a graduate student in my lab at BU, and Brian Maniscalco, who is a research scientist in Megan Peters' lab at UCI. So the starting point for this project is an intriguing potential dissociation that has been observed between objective and subjective perception. That dissociation is known as inattentional subjective inflation, which refers to findings that when objective performance is matched, unattended stimuli have been reported as more visible than attended ones. And this has led to the view that in the unattended visual periphery, our phenomenal experience can be inflated. That is, stronger, sharper, more vivid than the accuracy of sensory processes as measured by objective performance would suggest. But there's a bit of a quandary here. So on the one hand, the idea of subjective inflation has had a large influence on consciousness science. it has motivated higher order theories of consciousness, which say that there should be decoupling between objective processing and subjective experience. So these theories have taken this observation of subjective inflation as a kind of a motivating pillar for why we should have these separate kind of first order and higher order representations. Um, Subjective inflation has offered an explanation for the apparent richness of conscious perception in the peripheral visual field. So based on phenomena that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, like inattentional blindness and other types of behavioral evidence, you might think that, well, maybe we're just unaware of anything outside the central attentional focus. And yet our field of vision doesn't sort of introspectively seem to look like this. It actually seems to look more like this, maybe where you can sort of see better in the center, maybe worse in the periphery, but still have a rich, fully filled in field of vision. And subjective inflation has been proposed as an explanation for this putative discrepancy, where the idea there is that the unattended periphery is perhaps just inflated in our consciousness, even though we can't perform tasks well at those locations. And subjective inflation, for many of these reasons, is often discussed as a well-established phenomenon in both the neuroscience and philosophy literatures. I've listed several papers here, and this is actually not an exhaustive list of papers that rely on subjective inflation in some substantive way. So on the one hand, we have this, a large influence of the idea of subjective inflation. On the other hand, the empirical basis for inattentional inflation is actually quite limited. So it's only been tested at near threshold stimulus strengths. It's only been tested for low-level visual features like luminance contrast. And all of these studies that have been done have relied on null effects to equate objective performance, making it possible that perhaps there were indeed small differences in objective performance that underlaid the differences in subjective experience. But in general, there's just very few studies. And these studies have mixed results. So compared to sort of all the papers that I just showed you on the previous slide that rely on subjective inflation being true, compelling evidence for inattentional inflation really comes from just one study, this Ranev 2011 study. And other work since then has either found only very weak evidence for inflation or even no evidence at all. So, if subjective inflation really matters for our everyday conscious experience, it should be robust. It should extend beyond threshold vision. It should extend beyond these low-level visual features. So here we asked, is attentional inflation real, and is it pervasive? So we sought to rigorously test this phenomenon. To do that, we tested inflation under inattention in 4 experiments. We use both the low-level visual stimulus of contrast-defined gratings in noise, and also a mid-level visual stimulus that relies on texture segmentation. So that's these texture-defined figure ground ovals. So you should be able to see in the grating image at the top that there's lines pointed to the right inside some weak noise. And on the bottom, you should be able to see this vertical oval that's strongly popping out from the textured background, okay? So that would be an example of a very strong grading and a very strong texture-defined oval stimulus. So we tested actually 2 strength regimes, going from all the way from threshold to super threshold regimes. So this threshold regime where the grading and the oval stimuli are very difficult to detect. So you should see on the left of this continuum where the contrast of the grading has gotten less and less. It should be very difficult to see which direction those lines are pointing in the stimulus on the far left. And similarly, for the texture-defined oval, we control the strength of that figure ground pop-out stimulus by adjusting the line length to make those lines smaller and smaller and smaller, so that at the smallest line lengths on the left, it's quite hard now to see those ovals popping out from the background. So we have these 2 strength regimes, threshold to super threshold. Now, to manipulate spatial attention, we use the spatial attentional cueing task. On each trial, 4 stimuli were presented on the screen, 1 on each quadrant. So here, 4 stimulus locations here. And participants judge the orientation of one of the stimuli, which was indicated by a response cue at the end of the trial. So here, pointing to the upper right. Now, to manipulate spatial attention, we use a pre-cue at the beginning of the trial. Most of the time, the pre-cue was valid. So here, the pre-cue points to the upper right quadrant, and we call this a valid trial because participants are then asked to report that same stimulus in the upper right quadrant. So participants were incentivized to use this pre-cue to attend to the indicated location. However, sometimes the cue was invalid, so in this case, it's pointing to the upper left, where participants are later asked about the upper right, and it misdirected attention to the wrong location, or the pre-cue could be neutral, providing no location information, so participants would have to distribute their attention across all locations. Now, in the threshold regime, the tilts were always highly distinct, plus or minus 45 degrees for the gratings, and vertical or horizontal for the ovals. But the task was difficult because the stimulus strengths were very near threshold, so close to the individually titrated thresholds for each individual participant. So in the first experiment, which was this detection of threshold stimuli, we asked people on each trial to make a simultaneous objective and subjective report. So the objective report was to tell us the orientation of the stimulus, so plus or minus 45 degrees for the gratings, vertical or horizontal for the ovals. And also we asked them to make a subjective report. Did you see the stimulus or not? And we gave them very, detailed instructions about that they really needed to rely on their own subjective experience, not whether they thought the stimulus was really there or really not there, but just did they see it or did they not see it? And again, we use a single button press to collect both of these reports. So simultaneously, people are reporting the objective orientation of the stimulus as well as their subjective report about whether they saw the stimulus. All right, so with this data in hand, we can look first at whether we see subjective inflation for threshold level gratings. So here I'm plotting objective performance on the left here, and subjective visibility reports are going to appear on the right. So let's start with the neutral condition. So in the neutral condition, we see both as expected that the proportion of correct discrimination increases nicely sigmoidally with contrast, and also the proportion of time that participants reported seeing a stimulus increases with contrast as well. So that's good. Then let's just look at what happens when people are attending to the stimulus. So in valid trials in blue here, we have an increase in the proportion correct, and we have a decrease in the proportion correct when people are not attending. That's his invalid condition. And similarly for this subjective visibility, so attention also increases your likelihood of seeing the stimulus, and inattention and invalid decreases your likelihood of seeing the stimulus. So far, so good. This is all what we would expect from previous literature. So now the critical question is, what happens when we relate these objective and subjective reports? So we can assess subjective inflation by now plotting the proportion of seeing the stimulus, so that's from this figure here, as a function of the proportion correct, which is in the objective report over here in this figure. And so what we can do is for any given level of objective performance, we can ask how likely were people to see the stimulus when it was attended, unattended, and so forth. So that's these results here. So this measures how attention affects subjective reports while controlling for objective performance. And we can see then that for any given level of objective performance on the x-axis here, we can look to see what is the level of reported subjective perception And we can see that this is higher for unattended in red than attended in blue here for every level of objective performance that we measured. We have a nice toolbox if anyone is interested in doing the sort of similar analytical technique to relate these two psychometric functions together. So just wanted to put in a good word here for this relative psychometric function toolbox developed by Brian Maniscalco and Megan Peters' lab. And so then to quantify the degree of subjective inflation, we can simply take the area under this curve here for each of the attention conditions. And that's what I'm plotting on the right here in the bars. So this is now the area under the curve for invalid in red, neutral in gray, and valid in blue. And what we can see is that this area under the curve is higher when people are not attending. And so this is essentially the signature of subjective inflation. So this shows very clearly a robust subjective inflation for these threshold level gradings, and that is consistent with the Ranev et al. 2011 report. Okay, so far so good. The next question we need to ask is, okay, it happens for these low-level contrast-defined gradings. What about for the figure ground stimuli? So next we looked at the texture-defined figure ground ovals, also at a threshold level stimulus strength here, do the same analysis, and we find indeed, again, a nice robust inflation effect for these threshold level figure ground ovals. What about in the superthreshold regime? Okay, so a lot of our vision is not just at a very low levels of visibility, but is actually well into the superthreshold regime for our everyday vision. If inflation is going to matter for everyday vision, it should extend to the superthreshold regime. So now we tested what happens in the superthreshold regime. And in order to do that, we can't just ask participants whether they could see the stimulus or not, because again, now all of these stimuli are going to be in superthreshold, so they could see all of them very well. So now we want to ask, how strong does the stimulus look to you? Even if they're visible and they're superthreshold, we can still appreciate that some stimuli are stronger or weaker. So in order to assess that, we developed here a strength comparison task where we trained participants on a reference stimulus strength and then asked whether the stimuli appeared stronger or weaker than that reference. So again, we're still going to have the same objective report, which is an orientation report. But now the subjective report is how strong did the target stimulus appear? Was it stronger or weaker than the reference? And in this way, we could get a measure of subjective strength, subjective appearance in the superthreshold regime. Because we're in the superthreshold regime, we also made this orientation discrimination task challenging by actually adjusting the tilts of the gradings or the aspect ratios of the ovals to individual participants' discriminability thresholds. So for example, for the gradings, instead of having plus or minus 45, these thresholds might now be plus or minus 4 or plus or minus 5 to make this a challenging orientation discrimination task as well. Okay, so when we did this, we found that inflation at superthreshold, not only was it there, it was actually even much more pronounced than at threshold. And this was true both for the contrast-defined gradings and for the texture-defined figure ground ovals. So these findings were exciting to us because they suggested that attentional inflation was really robust and it was quite widespread across all these different stimulus regimes, different levels of visual processing, as well as both threshold and super threshold regimes. So this was very strong evidence for the robustness of subjective inflation. However, before we got too excited about these results, we needed to check an important question, which is, were people just basing the objective and subjective reports on different stimulus information? So for example, participants might report visibility based on some stimulus information that's separate from the orientation signal that's driving objective performance. So just like in this grainy security video here, or security photo here, you can tell that there's a person there without relying on the facial features that would indicate their identity. Maybe for these gratings, you could tell that there's a stimulus there by some aspect of the stimulus that doesn't actually give you information about the orientation itself. And this idea is related to what Matthias Mikel has called the criterion content fallacy. So this is the fallacy of concluding that subjects are conscious of the task-relevant features. So in this case, the task-relevant feature is orientation, based on the mere evidence that they're conscious of something, right? So we have to be really careful that when we're comparing objective and subjective reports, we're asking people to give us a subjective report on the same feature that determines their objective performance. So does subjective inflation occur for the feature that's also relevant for the objective task? In this case, again, orientation. And so far, when I've told you about people's subjective reports, we've just talked about stimulus visibility, so sorting participants' responses based on whether they said they saw a stimulus or not. But in fact, in 3 of the 4 experiments that I just showed you, we included 3 visibility response options, dividing the seen response into 2 options, either I saw a stimulus and its orientation, or I saw a stimulus but not its orientation. So this first option, I saw a stimulus and its orientation, is what we call feature visibility. So this quantifies the visibility of the task-relevant feature of orientation. Okay, so now we can do exactly the same analysis, but using only restricting seen reports to the visibility of the task-relevant feature. And let's see if inflation persists under this stricter reporting criterion. So for threshold contrast-defined gradings, we still find a very clear, strong subjective inflation, even when people are reporting this task-relevant feature. And this was also the case for texture-defined figure ground all ovals, although it was a bit weaker than for the full stimulus visibility. At superthreshold, however, objective performance actually fully predicted the subjective strength, and there was no inflation. So what this means is that subjective inflation persists for the task-relevant feature, but it does so only at threshold strengths. So based on all of this data, it seems like inflation is real, at least at threshold. It even survives this strong test of asking people to report their subjective visibility of the task-relevant feature. So we next ask, where does inflation come from, right? And to gain insight into this question, we took advantage of the fact that we had measured these full psychometric functions to examine how attention changes the internal signals related to performance and to visibility. So in order to compare these psychometric functions directly, we use their common units of stimulus strength. So of course, these psychometric functions I'm plotting here, either performance or visibility on the y-axis, so performance in blue, and then visibility in green here. And we see the solid line is for attended trials, the dashed line is for unattended trials. So performance and visibility have different scales. We plot them on different scales, either percent correct or percent seen, but we can relate them quantitatively to each other by asking how attention affects their common units, which is stimulus strength. So this is, in this case, grading contrast on the x-axis here. So for performance in blue, And for visibility in green, what we did is we picked a starting stimulus strength, like this CU right here for unattended. We found the psychometric function values for this unattended condition, and then we asked what contrast would be required to get the same performance or visibility in the attended condition. So in this case, we can just look over here. This is now matching the same level of visibility in the attended condition. And this distance here matches the same level of performance in the attended condition compared to the unattended condition. And we're measuring this on the x-axis now so that we can directly compare this change in visibility required to match attended and unattended, and the change in performance required to match attended and unattended. So we can do this for every single starting contrast value, and then plot these changes in effective stimulus strength with attention separately for performance in blue and for visibility in green. And where we have here the stimulus visibility is in light green and the feature visibility is in dark green. So across all of these contrast values, starting contrast values on the x-axis, we see that the performance change is greater than the visibility change with attention. And this was true for every experiment, with the one exception of the superthreshold gratings feature visibility. Right here, you can see this green, this dark green and blue are aligned here. That was the one case where we did not find inflation at all. So these findings suggest a sort of general principle that inflation occurs because attention increases the effective stimulus strength more for performance than for visibility. And indeed, we can actually show mathematically that inflation always occurs under these conditions and only occurs under these conditions. So this is kind of an if and only if situation. So we propose that this is actually the more sort of fundamental empirical fact rather than what might seem to be a kind of paradoxical inflation of unattended items. Inflation seems to reflect stronger effects of attention on performance than visibility thresholds. Okay, so to conclude this section, we see that subjective inflation under inattention is robust. So when we measured it in all these different ways across full psychometric functions at threshold and superthreshold stimulus strength regimes, for low-level grading stimuli, for mid-level texture-defined figure ground stimuli, we find inflation across all of these regimes, suggesting that it is truly quite a robust phenomenon. However, importantly, it's not ubiquitous. So subjective reports of the task-relevant feature do not inflate for suprathreshold stimuli. And this specific inflation failure is important because it means that the apparent richness of the visual periphery in everyday vision probably does not arise from an inflated subjective perception of visual discriminability. So we're not sort of hallucinating being able to discriminate features better than we really can. But instead, this likely arises from the subjective perception of coarser stimulus information that is discriminable in the periphery and that shows up in people's reports of seeing the stimulus overall. And that's quite consistent with work done by people like Michael Cohen, Ruth Rosenholz, Andrew Hahn, among others. And finally, we discovered this unifying principle that underlies the phenomenon of subjective inflation, namely that attention increases effective stimulus strength more for performance than for visibility. All right, so going now to the next study, we are asking how attention can warp perceptual appearance and whether it can really warp perceptual appearance rather than just boosting subjective strength. And this study was led by Angus Chapman, who is a postdoc on my lab and currently on the job market. Look out for Angus, as well as Melissa Alush, who was an MA student in the lab. So we talked at the beginning about how attention increases perceived intensity. This is a kind of statement that can summarize many of the effects that attention has on subjective perception, these effects on increasing visibility, confidence, apparent contrast, and so on. They can kind of be summarized by this general principle that attention increases perceived intensity. But there are also some indications that attention can also warp or distort the appearance of visual features. The main evidence for attentional warping of appearance comes from findings that attention distorts the appearance of visual space. So attending to a specific location in space can expand perceived space around that location, increasing perceived sizes, and also increasing perceived distances in that local region. So for example, I've taken this from this nice review. If the monkey is attending to this banana he's about to eat, he might perceive it as in a large size. And this has been attributed to the possibility of shifting receptive fields toward that location, which is represented by this array of white circles overlaid on the image on the right here. So there's evidence that in a sort of local region of space, attention can expand representations, but it's unknown what happens farther from the attended location. It's also unknown what happens for other visual features besides space. So we don't know if space is special due to the ways that attention can shift these spatial receptive fields. So the effect of attention on the appearance of an entire feature space has actually not been measured. So here we asked, how does attention affect the appearance of a full perceptual feature space? And if we want to characterize the appearance across a perceptual feature space, discrimination tasks are good for characterizing perceptual sensitivity at a certain point in a feature space. That's what we usually do. So we usually pick some single feature value, like discriminating clockwise versus counterclockwise tilts around vertical. And we can measure how attention increases discriminability and discrimination sensitivity around that single location. But these measures, as a result of focusing on that single location, are usually just blind to most of the feature space. So comparison tasks, in contrast, are better for characterizing appearance across a large feature space because they can quantify not just whether you can tell two stimuli apart, but also how different or how similar those two stimuli look to each other. And we can use these types of comparison tasks to assess similarity across all possible feature values. And then what we can do is use representational geometry to characterize the similarity structure of a feature space in order to really quantitatively get a sense of the perceptual structure. And of course, this relates to lots of work that has been going on about qualia spaces and characterizing those types of mathematical structures to relate to perceptual feature spaces. So here I'm just showing an example of a simple representational geometry where I'm plotting for all these different little image icons. People did many ratings, and you can look at these perceptual distances between, let's say, the plane and the bird. This red is lower, so this is a shorter distance. Orange is higher, so the plane versus the frog, this is a larger distance here, right? And then once you know all these distances, you can reconstruct, project these distances into some geometry, into some, in this case, this is just projected down into a two-dimensional geometry to visualize the relative distances among all of these different images in the space. Okay, so this is the general idea behind representational geometry. So we can ask, how does attention affect the representational geometry of a perceptual feature space? And the feature that we chose in this case to use is orientation, our favorite vision science feature, orientation. And on the left, I'm showing just the physical stimulus distance matrix So on the diagonal line here, this is when the stimuli are the same. So like horizontal and horizontal, these are the same, so the distance is 0. And as you move out, you start to get greater and greater distances, and these just like linearly change as you move out along this distance matrix. And we can take this distance matrix and project it into a two-dimensional geometry. And for the physical stimulus, 2 dimensions is completely enough to characterize the geometry of that physical stimulus. And as you might imagine, it is just a ring, just a circle in the 2D plane. So this is just an example of theoretical representational geometry for orientation. This is the representational geometry of the physical stimulus space for orientation. Now the question is, what will attention, well, first of all, what is the perceptual geometry for orientation? And then what will attention do to that perceptual geometry? And when we started this project, we thought about 2 possible hypothesized attentional changes to the representational geometry of orientation. So again, if we think about orientation as living on some kind of a ring, we thought first it's possible that attention to some target orientation could expand representations around that target orientation, similar to what has been found in the expansion of physical, like space, just visual space. Then another possibility is that attention could also have effects, quite far from the attended orientation potentially. So one possibility is that while attention expands representations around the target in this solid line here versus the dotted line here, perhaps attention also compresses representations far from the target. So we refer to this as distractor compression, where now when we're attending, this representation is kind of shrunken in, compressed in, compared to the original no attention condition. Okay, so this is the question: does attention expand representational space around targets? Does it compress representational space around distractors? And how far do these possible expansions and compressions extend through the feature space? To address this question, we developed this task, which is a kind of interleaved task, where the idea is that we first do a feature-based attention task to kind of set up people's feature-based attention, and then we present a probe task that allows us to measure the representational space for orientation. So in this feature-based attention task, what we're doing is we ask people to either attend to black or attend to white, and then count the small changes in tilt that are happening throughout this period. So this is a 3-second period in which we have these black lines going in one direction, say -45, white lines going in the other direction, say +45. These lines are jittering a little bit throughout the trial, so people are monitoring them, and every now and then the lines will do a little tilt, and the strength and coherence of that tilt is going to be thresholded for each observer, so that this is a challenging attentional task. You really have to pay attention to the black lines if you're monitoring that orientation for the small tilts, or pay attention to the white lines if you're monitoring that orientation for the tilts. And then the task of the observer is to just count the number of times that the attended lines are tilting. So for example, here we have 1 tilt there, we have another tilt there, so this would be 2 tilts in this 3-second period. Right after this feature-based attention task, where hopefully we've set up a strong feature-based attention to one orientation or the other orientation, we do this probe task, which we call a triad task, where we ask which one of these gratings, either on the left or on the right, is more similar to the center stimulus. Okay, so in this case, people might answer that the grating on the right is more similar to the center stimulus. And by doing these judgments over and over again, we can construct these perceptual distance matrices and then reconstruct people's representational geometry. So we have three conditions in this experiment. We have attend minus 45, where people are attending to the lines tilted minus 45, and these could also be either black or white on different blocks. And then we have a no attention, attend plus 45, of course, the other way, and then a no attention condition where we don't have any feature-based attention task. We just have many of these triad task trials so that we can get an estimate of people's representational geometry in the absence of any attentional modulation. We had a lot of trials per participant in this test. You need lots of trials to get enough data to estimate these representational geometries. And so first, I just want to show you basic behavioral data showing that indeed the reported number of tilts tracked the target orientation, but not the distractor, the tilts in the distractor orientation. So this is just a kind of confusion matrix showing, given each number of possible target tilts, how many tilts did people report? And in general, they reported the correct number of tilts most of the time, but also tended to just underestimate the number of tilts, which we expected because this is meant to be a challenging perceptual task. Whereas the reported tilts basically had no relationship with the number of distractor tilts. So the correlation with target tilts, 0.64, pretty high. The correlation with distractor tilts, essentially 0. So this just confirms that people were indeed doing the feature-based attention task correctly. So we used these triad similarity reports to construct these dissimilarity matrices. I'm just showing you here the group dissimilarity matrix for the entire data set. And then what we could do is fit geometric models to the trial-by-trial behavioral data, asking how all of the stimulus orientations would have to be positioned within an n-dimensional space such that their pairwise distances would best predict the similarity choices that participants made in the triad task. And unlike the physical representation of orientation, which is this 2D circle I showed you before, we actually found that a 4-dimensional model best explained the data. So here I'm plotting just the 3-dimensional fit for visualization. And as you can see, the structure of orientation perception is not this 2D circle as would be expected from the physical stimulus features, but rather even in 3D, we see this saddle shape. And in 4D, there are additional loops that emerge. So even in this 3D model, we start to see some separation between attention conditions around the attended orientations. So here you can see red, this is the attended, when you're tending to the minus 45 stimulus, is kind of pulling apart here from these other attention conditions in blue when you're tending plus 45 or when you're tending to 0. And this red dot here corresponds to the minus 45 degree orientation. Okay. So to quantify this expansion of the perceptual space, we calculated the local length of the representation, so the kind of distance along the representation in sliding windows. And that's what I'm plotting here. So here I'm plotting this local length on the y-axis as a function of orientation on the x-axis. So this is the distance around the orientation representation within each sliding window. The dotted lines show the target orientations at minus 45 and plus 45. Red here is attend to minus 45, and blue is a 10 to plus 45. Gray is the no attention triad only condition, and the squares indicate significant differences between attention conditions. And what we see here is that local length is longer overall at the task relevant orientation, so at minus 45 and plus 45. And on top of that effect, attention to one orientation further expands the representation around both target orientations. So here and here, sort of blue higher than red over here, red higher than blue over here. Here, I'm now collapsing across target orientations and then varying the size of the sliding window. Now we're centering the sliding window just around the target orientation in orange and around the distractor orientation in purple. The no attention condition is still in gray here. And we see that for a very large range of window sizes, there is a consistent expansion around target orientations compared to this no attention condition, and a consistent compression around distractor orientations compared to this no attention condition, sort of neutral, living somewhere in the middle across this wide range of window sizes. So now we reason that target expansion and distractor compression might actually have different optimal window sizes. So the next thing we did was examine the target versus distractor length difference for all possible window size combinations, and found that indeed the large attention effects emerge for different window sizes in the target, around and around the distractor. So around relatively narrow expansion windows around the target of about 40 degrees, and relatively broad compression windows around the distractor of about 120 degrees. The maximum attention effect here is indicated by the red dot, and this black line indicates the sort of significant region of this expansion plus compression. Okay, so to summarize these data, we found a narrow expansion around targets and together with a broad compression around distractors, just as we see here. So attention really changed not only the representation of the perceptual space very close to the target orientation, but that extended around some window, and then we see quite a large region of the space where we have distractor compression. So attention really can reshape almost the entire representation of orientation here. Finally, I just want to mention that we used a neural population tuning model that included both gain and normalization, and found that that could capture both the expansion and compression we saw in the perceptual geometry. So I won't spend too much time on this, but very happy to answer questions about it at the end. But very briefly, we found that a gain-only model in red here could very well produce the expansion, but really could not generate compression around the distractor orientation, whereas a model with gain plus normalization could actually generate both expansion and compression. So to conclude here, we found that attention to a specific orientation altered the relative appearance of almost all the orientations in feature space by reshaping the entire perceptual feature space. Representations expanded in a narrow range around attended target orientations, were compressed in a broad range around unattended distractor orientations. And these representational changes were captured by a neural population model with both attentional gain and normalization. So this all suggests that attention does not only enhance relevant features, but actually distorts perception throughout the feature space, which might allow more efficient transfer of behaviorally relevant information to downstream decision circuits and so on. So just to wrap up, I think this body of work has some implications for how we might think about consciousness science and more generally. So first, we find that attention decouples subjective perception from both objective performance in the first study and also from physical stimulus features in the second study. And both of these kinds of effects provide opportunities to identify neural activity that's specific to subjective perception when either the physical stimulus or performance are controlled. Next, we've shown here some methods for characterizing detailed patterns of subjective perception, either across full ranges of stimulus features, as well as under various cognitive manipulations, in this case, attention manipulations. But you could imagine using these same kinds of mathematical approaches to characterize both psychometric functions and representational geometry across much wider ranges of cognitive manipulations as well. And of course, we're we're not the first to use either psychometric functions or representational geometry, but here just showing how by coupling these approaches with cognitive manipulation, we can generate really rich decouplings between these different kinds of measures. And finally, here we provide some targets for richer and thus more constrained mappings between neural activity and perceptual experience. And so these approaches can, I think, advance consciousness science beyond the seen versus unseen comparisons that have dominated the field, and really are kind of in that consistent direction with a lot of the current work being done on quality spaces and so on, in thinking about how can we characterize detailed properties of perceptual experience that will allow us to get more traction on mapping those complex features of perceptual experience to the brain. And so with that, let me just thank all the wonderful collaborators who have contributed to these projects, particularly Karen Tian, Angus Chapman, Megan Peters, and Brian Maniscalco. And thank you all. I was really, yeah, appreciate the chance to be here and be happy to take some questions.